Rachel, a hardworking single mother, faces constant pressure and criticism from her boss, Mr. Grant, who dismisses her requests for flexibility to care for her children. One day, after he belittles her situation and suggests she isn't committed enough, Rachel bravely stands up for herself. She explains the strength her family gives her and demands respect, leaving Mr. Grant visibly shocked. Her courage inspires her co-workers, who begin supporting one another and seeking fair treatment. Over time, the company subtly shifts toward a more understanding culture. Rachel's actions not only empower her, but also inspire lasting change for everyone around her. Rachel gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she glanced at the clock. Another long day lay ahead, and even now, before dawn, her mind raced with all the tasks awaiting her at home and work. As the lone caregiver to two young children, Rachel had learned to manage a balancing act that few could truly understand. Her days started early, very early, and ended late, but she had a routine down to a science. She carefully checked her list for the day's errands, silently promising herself she'd handle it all, just as she always did. After quietly rousing her children, Rachel went about preparing breakfast, a simple meal, but the best she could manage on a tight budget. She set out their lunches, made sure they had their school things, and reminded herself to leave a little note in each lunchbox. "You're amazing, don't forget it," she'd written on each card. It was a small gesture, something her kids always appreciated, and it gave Rachel a glimmer of comfort. Her children were her world, her strength, and though her life was far from easy, she was determined to give them everything she could. Once they were ready for school, Rachel took a deep breath, kissed each of them on the forehead, and hurried out the door. The city was still cloaked in a sleepy quiet, with only a few other early risers heading to their own jobs. As she walked into her office building, Rachel put on a brave face. She was punctual, reliable, and an asset to the team. But she knew all too well that in the eyes of her boss, Mr. Grant, she was merely a worker with a few too many distractions in her life. Rachel made her way to her desk, already feeling the familiar weight of expectations pressing down on her. She hadn't even sat down when Mr. Grant's sharp voice sliced through the quiet office. "Rachel, my office, now." She took a steadying breath and walked to his office, trying to ignore the knot forming in her stomach. Mr. Grant sat behind his desk, his expression as hard as the gray metal of his chair. Without looking up, he gestured for her to sit, a gesture more commanding than polite. Rachel complied, watching him closely as he continued to sift through some papers with a look of clear annoyance. After a moment, he finally looked up, fixing her with a piercing stare. "Rachel," he began, his tone icy, "I've noticed you've had a few requests for early leave over the past couple of weeks." He leaned back, crossing his arms as if to signal that he wasn't here for an explanation, only to issue a reprimand. "I understand that you're a single mother," he continued, his voice dropping just slightly on the last words, "but I expect you to perform like everyone else here." Rachel's face warmed, and she fought to keep her expression neutral. She had asked for flexibility only twice that month, once to take her daughter to a doctor's appointment and once to attend her son's school event. She'd made up the time, working late into the night, and her results had never suffered. But Mr. Grant didn't care. He didn't want excuses or explanations. He wanted obedience. "Mr. Grant, I understand," she began carefully, trying to keep her voice steady. "I know my personal situation shouldn't interfere with work, but—" He cut her off with a dismissive wave. "I'm not interested in hearing about your personal situation, Rachel. What I'm interested in is commitment to this job. If you can't manage your priorities, perhaps it's time you reconsider your position here." The words hit her like a slap, and she felt a lump forming in her throat. But she forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to let him see her break. Rachel's hands clenched tightly in her lap, her mind racing with the words she wanted to say. She wanted to tell him about the sleepless nights, the constant balancing act, and the deep love for her children that pushed her to work harder than ever. But she knew Mr. Grant wouldn't understand. He had never shown an ounce of empathy toward her or anyone else in the office. For him, life outside of work was a mere inconvenience, a distraction from what he believed was the only thing that mattered: company productivity. "Mr. Grant," she began again, swallowing hard to keep her voice steady. "I assure you, my work is always my priority here. I have never let my personal life get in the way of meeting deadlines or achieving results. I stay late to make up the time, and Staying late is the least you can do, Rachel," he interrupted, a hint of scorn coloring his words. "Everyone here has responsibilities, but they don't use them as excuses. It's clear that if you're not willing to give this job 100%, there are others who will." The subtle threat hung in the air, and Rachel felt a wave of frustration mixed with sadness. She thought of her children again, their innocent faces waiting for her at home, trusting her to be both their provider and protector. They had no idea how much she endured to keep their lives as steady as possible. Her son had been looking forward to seeing her at his school assembly next week, a day she had carefully planned to leave work an hour early. But hearing Mr. Grant now, she realized even that small promise might be out of reach. Rachel squared her shoulders, a quiet resolve building within her. "Mr. Grant, I want to be clear. I am here because I care about my work. I give this job my all because I need to support my family. But my children, they're my responsibility too. I will always do my best to balance both, but I need a bit of flexibility at times." He laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "Flexibility? Let me tell you, Rachel, flexibility is a luxury, not a right. And if you're not cut out for this, I'd suggest you think carefully about whether you're suited for a corporate environment at all." Rachel sat in silence, her heart pounding. His words weren't just dismissive. They were meant to put her in her place, to remind her that her role here was nothing more than that of a worker. But she realized, sitting across from him, that her role in life was so much bigger than that. Rachel sat still, letting Mr. Grant's words echo in her mind. A luxury. Flexibility was a luxury in his world, something only granted to those he deemed deserving. But Rachel knew that for her, flexibility wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. It was the difference between being able to take her daughter to the doctor when she was ill, or leaving her alone to fend for herself. It was what allowed her to be present in her children's lives, even if only in fleeting moments between shifts and responsibilities. Mr. Grant continued, oblivious to the impact of his words. "Frankly, Rachel, I don't know how other people manage, but they do. Maybe you should look to them for an example." He leaned forward, lowering his voice as if confiding a secret. "You're not here to make friends or seek sympathy. This isn't a charity, Rachel. It's a business." His words were cold, calculated, and designed to make her feel small. But Rachel wasn't small. She was tired, yes, and often overwhelmed, but she was strong. She held herself together for her children, knowing they depended on her every day. Her exhaustion wasn't weakness. It was the weight of a life lived for others. And in that moment, something inside her began to change. She looked him directly in the eyes, her voice firm. "Mr. Grant, I understand this is a business, and I don't ask for sympathy, but I do ask for a little understanding. The dedication I bring to this job, anyone else would be proud of that. I work late, I take on extra assignments, and I never complain. But I am not a machine. I am a mother who has 2 children who depend on her, and sometimes they need me too." Mr. Grant's eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation breaking through his mask of indifference. He didn't like being challenged, especially not by someone he saw as little more than an expendable employee. "You're walking on thin ice, Rachel," he warned, his voice low and controlled. "I don't think you realize the risk you're taking by talking to me like this. There are dozens of people who would be grateful for your position. People who wouldn't need understanding or special treatment." Rachel felt a surge of emotion rise within her, but it wasn't fear. She had been afraid of losing this job, afraid of disappointing her children, afraid of failing at the life she had built. But now, sitting across from a man who saw her as nothing more than a replaceable part, she felt a calm clarity. She was more than this job, more than Mr. Grant's dismissive assumptions. She was fighting for her children, for the life she wanted to give them, and for her right to be treated with respect. With a steady voice, she replied, "Mr. Grant, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for the respect that every hard-working person deserves. I am willing to work just as hard as anyone, but I need to know that I'm more than just a number to this company. My children are part of who I am, and if that's a problem, then maybe this isn't the right place for me after all." The silence that followed was tense, charged with the weight of her words. For the first time, Rachel saw a flicker of surprise in Mr. Grant's eyes, a reaction she had never expected. In that moment, she knew she had crossed a line, but it was a line she had needed to cross for herself, for her children, and for anyone who had ever felt overlooked and dismissed. Mr. Grant sat back, crossing his arms and tapping his fingers thoughtfully on the edge of his desk. The surprise that had briefly flickered in his eyes was gone, replaced by a hardened, steely glare. "Rachel, I think you're failing to grasp the reality of your position here," he said, his tone sharper now, as if she had crossed a line that he would not allow her to forget. "We hired you to work, not to negotiate terms based on personal circumstances." Rachel's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, letting him continue. She'd heard these words before, from people who didn't know her or understand what it meant to be a single mother working multiple shifts, always fearing that one missed day could unravel everything she'd built. But hearing it from him now, after all her dedication and sacrifice, left a deep sting she hadn't expected. Mr. Grant leaned forward, pressing his hands flat on the desk. "Look," he said with a forced calmness, "if you really can't manage your time better, maybe we should reevaluate if this position is right for you. We don't need exceptions here, Rachel. We need people who can commit, without making excuses. Do you understand?" Rachel looked at him, feeling a swell of anger and defiance she could no longer contain. Her eyes didn't waver, and she spoke with a quiet strength that was now unshakable. "Mr. Grant, I've worked for this company for years. I've met every deadline, put in hours beyond my shift, and sacrificed more than you could ever know to be here. But I don't work here because I need a place that doesn't care about my life beyond these walls." His face darkened, but Rachel continued, refusing to back down. "I know my value. I'm here because I am good at what I do. You may see my family as a distraction, but it's my strength. They are the reason I am able to work as hard as I do. And if you can't see that, then maybe I am in the wrong place." There was a strange stillness in the room as her words settled between them. Mr. Grant opened his mouth as if to retaliate, but the look in Rachel's eyes stopped him. This wasn't the defeated single mother he'd expected to corner. This was a woman who had built her life brick by brick, who had faced tougher challenges than his condescension, and who knew her worth, even if he didn't. Rachel felt the tension release, as if finally speaking the truth had lifted an enormous weight. The silence stretched, and she glanced at the clock, realizing she had to pick up her kids soon. She rose from her chair, gathering her things and looking directly at Mr. Grant. "I'll finish my work before I go, as I always do," she said firmly. "But don't think for a second that I'll compromise on the respect I deserve. Not for you, not for anyone." Mr. Grant watched her leave, silent and expressionless, as she walked out of his office. As Rachel walked back to her desk, she felt the tension in her shoulders slowly dissolve, replaced by a quiet sense of triumph. Her heart was still pounding, and a part of her worried about what might happen next. But for the first time, she felt truly free. She had stood up not just for herself, but for her children, and for every parent who had ever felt torn between providing for their family and being present for them. She could feel the eyes of her co-workers on her as she settled back at her desk. Word had spread quickly. Some of them had heard snippets of the conversation through the thin walls, while others simply noticed the hardened look on Mr. Grant's face as she left his office. But this time, the looks she received were different. Her co-workers weren't pitying her or silently wondering how she managed her life outside work. Instead, there was a newfound respect, a subtle nod of understanding and solidarity. A few even gave her small, encouraging smiles, and she felt warmth return to a place that had often seemed cold and indifferent. Rachel resumed her work, her focus sharper than ever, determined to leave her desk as she always did, with everything in order, no loose ends. She finished her tasks, packed her belongings, and quietly rose to leave. But as she turned, she saw a small gathering of her colleagues near her desk. One by one, they began to speak up, voices low but filled with sincerity. "Rachel, that was brave. I don't think any of us have ever seen anyone stand up to Mr. Grant like that," one woman said, her voice filled with admiration. Another colleague nodded, stepping forward with a look of empathy. "I think we all just felt what you were saying in there. A lot of us are balancing work with things that matter, things that make us who we are. And sometimes it feels like Mr. Grant, like he just doesn't get it." Rachel was moved, caught off guard by their words. She'd always felt like she was fighting this battle alone, never realizing how many of her colleagues had felt the same way. She wasn't the only one struggling to balance her work and personal life. In her decision to speak up, she had unknowingly voiced the concerns and frustrations of so many others who felt silenced. Just then, another co-worker, a father who had once confided in her about missing his child's birthday to finish a late project, spoke up. "You know, Rachel, what you did in there, it reminded me that we don't have to just accept everything that's thrown at us. We're not machines. We're people with lives beyond these walls. And if we're giving our best here, we deserve to be respected, not dismissed." Rachel felt a lump in her throat as she listened, nodding slowly. She had felt alone in that room with Mr. Grant, but now, surrounded by her co-workers, she felt the strength of a community, a silent, shared resilience that had been waiting for someone to ignite it. Each word of encouragement, each nod of agreement felt like a validation of her worth, her struggle, and her decision to stand up for herself. As she gathered her things and prepared to head out, she turned to her colleagues, gratitude filling her voice. "Thank you, all of you. I didn't know you felt this way, too. Maybe it's time we all remember our worth, not just as workers, but as people." With that, Rachel walked toward the door, her heart lighter, her steps firmer. She wasn't sure what awaited her tomorrow, but she knew that tonight she was going home with a sense of pride and newfound courage that couldn't be taken from her. As Rachel walked out of the office building, she felt an unfamiliar lightness in her step. The evening air was cool, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to enjoy it without the heavy weight of work pressing down on her. She'd spoken her truth, but more than that, she had shown herself and her children what it meant to stand up with courage, even when it felt like the odds were against her. The next day, Rachel walked into the office ready for whatever might come. She expected more coldness, perhaps even disciplinary action, but instead she noticed a surprising change in the office atmosphere. Her colleagues greeted her with warm smiles, and she could sense an energy shift. Word had spread about what she'd said to Mr. Grant, and her bravery had rippled through the company, sparking quiet conversations and newfound resolve among her co-workers. They no longer whispered anxiously in the break room about unfair expectations. They began openly discussing how they could balance work and life with more support and respect. To Rachel's surprise, even Mr. Grant seemed changed. The hard edges of his demeanor had softened, and he now observed her with something almost like respect, or, at the very least, acknowledgement. When he passed her that morning, he nodded curtly, his face neutral, but his gaze less dismissive. It was a small gesture, but in the world they worked in, it was significant. It meant she'd planted a seed, one that had left an impression he couldn't easily ignore. Over time, Rachel's courage inspired small but meaningful changes within the company. More flexible policies were introduced, and employees were encouraged to speak openly about work-life balance without fear of reprimand. Rachel herself was quietly approached by several co-workers who thanked her for her honesty, sharing stories of how her courage had given them the confidence to speak up about their own needs. In the end, Rachel had not only fought for herself and her family, but had become a quiet force of change. She had shown her children and her colleagues what it meant to be strong, to believe in one's worth, and to stand up, even when it wasn't easy. Walking through those office doors each day, she no longer felt like a nameless worker. She was Rachel, a single mother, a dedicated professional, and a woman who had faced her fears and inspired everyone around her to do the same. As she headed home that evening, her children greeted her with laughter and open arms, and in their warmth, she found a peace that no paycheck or approval could ever give. She was where she belonged, and she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she had the strength to face them. One step at a time,